The drafting of our next essay project is just around the corner, and I would be willing to bet that a lot of us will be working on that during the February break. So, I'm coming to you today with a discussion of some things to consider as you both plan the draft and write it. I'm going to be emphasizing that two-step process for this and for all other drafts of other essays coming up. It's going to make a lot of sense to do some planning first. We don't just want to jump into the writing before that. There are decisions to make. Number one. Remember, and if you have not yet gone over the assignment yourself, I do recommend doing so. It's going to make the rest of this make a lot of sense. The assignment has to do with deciding whether or not social media has a positive or negative effect on public discourse by way of having us decide whether or not whatever social media platform we decide has caused discourse to be ethical or unethical. That's going to mean choosing both a single social media platform and a single topic of discourse. It comes down to the fact that actually this essay is not terribly long. I know that if you haven't done much writing before, a 5-page essay might seem to be pretty long. You might be looking at this saying it's going to, or pardon me, thinking it's going to take forever. It won't, though. Assuming that you answer all the necessary questions of the assignment, assuming that you develop all the necessary ideas of the assignment, trust me when I say you're going to have plenty to talk about. So anyway, we'll need the first two of those things to be clear decisions. Again, a single social media platform to look at and a single topic of discourse to use in our analysis. Following that, we'll want to look for any prominent figures who have emerged in the discourse surrounding the topic. It oftentimes happens in social media that one person's voice rings most loudly for a variety of reasons. It might be the number of posts that are made, it might be the variety of the posts, it might be the reason that the posts have been made more visible on the social media platform, given the way that so many of these use algorithms that actually take things that are popular and move them to the top of whatever you see. Finally, we are going to do the first three of these things, choose the platform, choose the topic, and look for prominent figures so that we can decide in the planning process what argument we plan to make. And of course, you can see the way that deciding on the argument we plan to make is going to directly lead to whatever our main idea in the writing is going to be. Thinking for a second about what the writing is going to consist of, the main rhetorical mode we're going to be using here is cause and effect, right? And what that means, and think back to the discussions that we've done earlier this semester having to do with rhetorical modes in developing writing. The writing itself is primarily going to be exploring and trying to establish exactly what the link is between cause and effect. Now, for this essay, we're starting with an effect. We're looking at something as being ethical or unethical, and you can sort of think of yourselves as backtracking a little bit. The question is, what causes the ethical or unethical nature of discourse? There are multiple layers to this. There are actually going to be some even smaller questions we've got to answer along the way, including, does what happens in the discourse cause one of the problems that Sellers writes about? How does the discourse affect its audience's understanding of the topic? How does the social media platform you've chosen affect the scope of discourse? Does the preponderance of evidence point to ethical discourse or unethical discourse? If ethical, how does the reading, watching audience understand the topic better? On the other hand, if unethical, how does the reading or watching audience actually understand it worse? How is it ill served by the way in which the social media platform has caused the discourse around the topic to be unethical? Looking then at the planning process, of course, we'll need an introduction. I'm a fan of short introductions. Again, for the relatively limited essays that we're going to write here, we don't need to do very much in that introduction. Really just think of that as offering up a shelf for a main idea and any explanation we've got to do with that main idea. We've already talked in the space of this short presentation about what that main idea would have to be. In other words, the main idea needs to be stating whether or not the social media and topic we're looking at have both shaped the discourse around the topic to be ethical or unethical in its effects on the common good and how well people understand the topic, right? So as long as the introduction contains that main idea and does any lead up to it or explanation of it that's necessary, the introduction's doing its job. Following that, thinking about what the body's going to have to do, we'll want to start with a general discussion of the topic. We do that not because the future reader of our essay knows nothing. The future reader probably knows something of it, but we want to make sure that that future reader of our essay understands the topic in the way that we do. If we don't make sure of that first, then we lack a good way of making sure that the analysis we're about to present is going to ring as true to the reader as it does to us. After that, we want a general discussion of public discourse and discussion of Sellers' essay and ideas, given that this is the main theoretical or conceptual framework we're working with. So we're going to be discussing this as a way of deploying it. In other words, making it known to the reader in a way that allows us to then go on to use it where we need to. So we'll be identifying any individual points made by Sellers that will then be important to the essay later on. And again, this is why I'm stressing the planning process first. Now, as we go about integrating material from Sellers into the essay, there's a real simple framework I'd recommend using here. We start with an according to phrase. So, according to Sellers, following that, we've got the quoted material, and of course, that's in quotation marks. After that quote is over, but between the end quote and the period, we include an APA end citation. And the APA end citation consists of three things: it's the author's last name, it's the year of publication, and finally, the page number from which we take the quoted material. Right? So, again, just looking at the structure that we use to integrate this material, according to Sellers, insert quoted material here. After quoted material, but before the period, we make sure that we've got the we make sure that we've got the in-text citation that we can then tie to the end citation that we include. Lastly, in this slide at least, pardon me, you'll be using the quote, explain, apply framework. And this comes indirectly from the reading that you've been doing from the Bazerman textbook. In other words, where we take a direct quote from an outside source, we include the quote first. After that, we explain it through a combination of paraphrase and short summary. And then finally, we apply it the way that we need to. So, for the purposes of this essay, we take the quote from Sellers, we explain what it is Sellers means, and then the apply step consists of us talking about what it is in regards to our topic and the discourse surrounding it has to do with the quote from Sellers or not, right? So, if Sellers is saying at one point that tribalism represents a real problem for the way that discourse works, we explain why that is, and then we look to the material that we're talking about for our analysis and show where there is tribalism, if that's what we're applying. Continuing our discussion of the body, we will then next need to talk about the social media platform that we're using for our discussion. That'll start with an introduction of the platform itself. So a little bit of Googling here is a good thing. The recent history of the platform, probably good. And if you do happen to notice that there's anything interesting about the larger background or the further history going back to its beginnings, feel free to enter that. It comes down to what you feel is going to be relevant to the analysis you're doing. If you can see any patterns here having to do with the way that users tend to communicate, this would be the place to do it. Consider that on certain social media platforms, the usage of short videos is actually much more prevalent than on other ones. This would be an example of talking about how users tend to communicate on that platform. Next, think about who the main user base of the platform is. Notoriously, Facebook is used by people who tend to be a little bit older than, say, the average college student. So think about that kind of thing. Next, consider what the political or ideological leanings of users on the social media platform are. Some social media platforms give themselves over to discourse that happens to be on the left or liberal. Other ones tend to give themselves over to social media discourse that is a little bit more on the right or conservative. So the best sense of that you've got would be an important thing to lay out here. Then ask yourself, is there any one main message or idea being communicated by the topic on that social media platform? Oftentimes, given the political leanings of the platform, there's going to be a main message that gets communicated about whatever the topic is you're working with. Now, the discussion of public discourse having to do with the social media platform and the topic will mean selecting examples that support your main idea and which demonstrate how the discourse about the topic is or is not ethical. If images are a part of the discourse, and memes can be a useful way of communicating ideas, so look for those, feel free to discuss and include them too. But this is the part where we're looking for the evidence that's going to support the main idea we've got. So this is very important. This is probably what we're going to want to put the most time into. The evidence is what supports what we're saying. It's the building blocks that our argument is built upon. we not only have to have a lot of it, but it needs to be relevant and it needs to be of good quality. Thinking about what our conclusion is going to be, and it is tough thinking about what a conclusion does. This is something that I think confuses a lot of us. The main thing any confusion or conclusion, excuse me, should do is look back at what the essay has accomplished. And this is a good way of understanding why it is that we don't really want to introduce something new in a conclusion. That's simply not part of the conclusion's job. The conclusion should draw conclusions having to do with the findings that you wrote about in the essay. If the discourse was ethical, what did it help its reader or viewer to understand better? If the main idea was that the discourse was unethical, how and why did the topic itself become divisive and difficult as it appeared on the social media platform you chose? Finally, we want to draw conclusions about social media's potential to be a medium of communication. So, in general, what effects does social media have on the information it conveys? And based on the main idea of the essay, are you saying that those effects tend to be positive or tend to be negative? Thinking about the writing itself. As before, remember that the ideas come first. We have to make sure they make sense. If the ideas aren't there, then it doesn't matter how nice and pretty and interesting the writing is. Writing that conveys nothing in the academic sense doesn't do anybody any good. The process analysis that we've already done is actually a really good example of how any writing should work, in that process analysis looks at individual steps and reflects on how those things relate to each other. In similar fashion, writing goes step by step, point by point. It's just one thing after the last, one thing, and the next and the next and the next. Keep the assignment nearby, consult it often. Make sure that you know what the assignment is asking you to do and make sure that you're doing it. State your main idea at the beginning and make sure it's clear and stick to it, right? That clear main idea needs to be a guiding factor, not just for the reader who eventually gets to the essay, but for the writing of the essay. It's okay if the main idea changes, but you've got to make sure that you know that by, maybe going back and rereading a draft after it's done. And you've got to make sure to revise accordingly. We can't just leave a main idea that doesn't really fit the rest of the essay. Stay out of your own way as you write. In other words, what I mean by that, keep the wording simple, right? Don't overcomplicate the wording to where it gets in the way. Use short, direct sentences. Again, we avoid overcomplicating sentences so that they don't get in the way of the ideas. Paragraphs should only be long enough to make a single clear point, right? So if we're looking at a paragraph that takes up an entire page, that is almost guaranteed to have multiple points in it, and that's not what a paragraph does, right? Structurally, a paragraph should help the reader to explain what it is that's being said and to expect a single point to be developed. Lastly, and you've seen this comment on your drafts and other writing, I'm sure, proofread. Proofread slowly, out loud, proofread to catch wrong and missing words and other clarity errors. And if it's at all possible, consider reading to someone else to help this process along. Now, as you write, remember a draft is a draft. That means several things, though. First, it's a first chance to write the essay, and the closer the draft is to what the final essay needs to be, the more helpful it will be. The final essay needs to be 5 pages long. If you produce a draft that's only about a page and a half long, it doesn't really matter how much correction I do to it. That's not giving you very much of an idea of what to do to make that draft into the final it's got to be. The draft doesn't have to be good. And I've got a link included here in the presentation to an essay that I like to use when first major essays are due. It's by an author named Anne Lamott, and the name of the essay is Shitty First Drafts. It is about exactly what you would imagine it is. And you can click on that link too. Um, the idea in the essay is that any author just has to get rid of the things that don't work. We've kind of got to get all of the writing out, whether it's good or not. And once we've done that, we can kind of pick through it and decide what we want to keep. Finally, thinking about drafts and how drafts need to work. Well, this draft needs to be handed into the Blackboard Dropbox by 11:59 p.m. February 27th, 2022, just so that I can walk into my office the next day and start correcting it. So this has been a discussion of the planning and writing of the public discourse essay. I'd ask you to send me any questions you've got, and I'll make sure to answer those to the best of my ability. Thanks.